Thank you, Nick, and members and guests. I have no disclosures. So let me leave this up for a bit, but I'll get to my slides here. There are rules for podium presentations, and this is one way to do it, but for presidential presentations, I think this speaks loudly. Keep it short, keep it personal. Unfortunately, it won't be short. So first, I want to dedicate this address to, will this go forward? All right. There we go. Thank you. To Mom and Dad, Nancy and Lou. I want to also acknowledge my brothers. However, I first want to go back a generation. I hope to weave throughout this address the importance of education. From an oral history left us on cassette, my mother's father, Pangrazio Pallaroli, described his brief formal education in Sora, Italy, which is 30 miles south and east of Rome. He walked 6 miles round trip each day to a schoolhouse beginning at age 8 for 3 consecutive years before being called back to work in the fields. Mom would say he could read the good Italian, the textbook Italian, from this brief education. He'd leave on a steamship for Canada at age 16, crossed into the U.S. to work in Flint before being called to service in the U.S. Army in 1917 for the Great War. He fought in the Argonne Forest, gained U.S. citizenship, but returned to Sora to marry Giuseppe Tersini in 1922. He returned to the U.S. alone in 27 after 2 daughters were born, Amelia and Nancy. Mom told us time and again accurately that she was born a U.S. citizen based on the citizenship of her father. My grandmother refused to leave Italy until around 1936. By that time, Mussolini was in power. My Aunt Emily recalls marching at school for Mussolini, the Italian dictator, founder of fascism. My grandmother's gold wedding ring was taken, and all gold objects forcibly taken under the guise of making a crown for Il Duce's wife. So Emily and Nancy, and later my Uncle Gino, would be the first to have a formal education in a family, and the same goes for my father's side of the family. His father, Antonio, left around 1911 from Molinaro, which is a small town east of Naples. There they developed a reputation in the region, and they were given a nickname, Testa Dura, which is hard head. He would later marry Costanza Manuel from the same village, whom he had never met. After writing a series of letters, and upon her landing in New York in 21, they were married. Costanza's mother, Maria Donata, feared for Costanza's life. She said the ship might sink, and Costanza responded, I don't care. She preferred death over staying at Molinaro. So, and Antonio would eventually take up Henry Ford on the $5 a day wage. There we go. He worked for 35 years at the Rouge plant, unskilled labor. He replaced bricks in the open hearth. They had 8 children, 7 sons and a daughter. Dad was the 5th son, born in 27. He and his siblings would be the first in the family to receive any formal education. He finished Mackenzie High in May of 45, just in time to enlist in the Navy for World War II. It was a month after his oldest brother, Carmen, a private in the 20th Infantry, 8th Infantry Division, was killed in action. There's Antonio. So Carmen was killed on April 2nd during the Battle of the Bulge, the waning days of the war in Europe, and just 1 month before VE Day. My grandparents proudly displayed his Purple Heart with oak leaf cluster at their modest home on Detroit's west side. 3 of their grandsons would carry his name, including myself. Okay. So Mom would always say I favored my father's side. She'd say, you're a Cirocco, you're a Testa Dura. Do you know what that means? That means hard head. And this was evident from birth, as Mom kept a calendar of our births, and She was admitted to the hospital a total of 16 days for false labor in the month of December 1958, 7 trips to the hospital before I finally arrived on December 27th. Clearly Testaduda. Now, George C. Scott won an Academy Award for his performance in the movie Patton, and in a scene depicting a July 22nd, 1943 incident in Sicily, Patton's 7th Army was held up in a single armored column, and they encountered strafing by German aircraft, all because of an obstruction at a narrow bridge. 2 stubborn mules were hauling a cart, and they refused to move despite the pleadings of their owner. In the film, the Sicilian owner can be heard saying the words Testaduda just before Patton took out and fired his ivory-gripped Colt .45 revolver, killing the mules who were unceremoniously dumped over the bridge, and the 7th Army continued to roll towards Messina. Testaduda can be a curse. Dad was served 34 years in the fire department, working multiple jobs to support the family, as did most firemen. The booming 1950s economy of Detroit had hit a downward turn, and the city contracted from a population of nearly 2 million, 90% white, in the 50s to 1 million, 90% black by the 70s, today under 700,000. With the reversal of the racial makeup of the city as its citizens moved out in what was termed white flight, we were compelled to live within city limits because of residency requirement. So the northeast section of the city where we lived became known as Copper Corner. That was after the metal component of the badges of the many firemen and policemen who headed up the majority of the households in this ethnically but not racially diverse area. It borders Grosse Pointe in the suburbs north of 8 Mile. The 24-hour duty of firemen was an introduction to extended work hours and overnight call. However, there was no weekly work limit. Dad would come home early in the morning, change, and head off to his second job, washing windows, walls, or painting for homeowners, including mansions, mostly in the Grosse Pointe communities. When we reached a mature age and were available, my brothers and I would assist him on the jobs. We never saw the owners, mainly the daily attendants and maids who kept up and managed the households. We didn't need a lecture to understand the concept that these homeowners were professionals, mainly attorneys and physicians, and that the diplomas on the walls were the difference between living there and working there. You get no complaints from us. They put away what they had, put us through Catholic school outside of the Detroit public school system. The premium on education and their sacrifice to provide it was never discussed. No lecture required. We instinctively competed on the field and in the classroom. Our lives revolved around school and sports. It was around that time at age 7 I had my first brush with surgical specialists. After suffering blood trauma to my left thumb after visiting Sarnia, Ontario, for a square dancing convention, my parents often participated in. I had emergency surgery and developed both a postoperative SSI. I had green pus and lymphangitis up my left arm, red streaks, which cleared with antibiotics. But I also had a missed tendon injury that required the services of a surgical specialist, Joe Posh, an orthopedic-trained hand surgeon, one of the first in the country, and also one of the first to provide postgraduate training in surgery of the hand. His first 30 trainees started the Joe Posh Hand Society that would evolve into the American Association for Hand Surgery. Had its first meeting in 1971. So Detroit, like most U.S. cities of the late 60s, was racially divided. The late 60s saw civil unrest, and the summer of 67 was memorable for a one-week period in late July, when a late-night incident involving Detroit police at a blind pig boiled into a full-scale riot with 500 patients presenting to the Detroit Receiving Hospital in the first 36 hours of what was later called a civil disturbance. Chair of the department, Alexander Walt, would later compare the violence to the Blitz, which he witnessed firsthand in London in World War II. He mobilized the faculty, residents, and staff to attend to a total of nearly 1,500 patients, 46 killed, nearly 1,200 injured, and 2,000 buildings destroyed from July 23 to 28 in 67. He also involved WC-trained general surgeons practicing in the community on standby. Just months later, he reported the anatomy of a civil disturbance, its impact on disaster planning at the Washtenaw County Medical Society meeting in Ann Arbor in 1968. We didn't see Dad for 3 days, but Dr. Walt's family didn't see him for a week. The firemen were on around-the-clock rotation. Between the Michigan Army National Guard deployed by Governor Romney and the Vietnam battle-tested 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions of the Army, sent by LBJ, a total of 7,000 troops, including tanks, along with 360 Michigan State police troopers, were sent in to quell the riot. My Uncle Gino drove Mom and us boys to see Dad, who was stationed at Corrigan Field in the city's Near East Side. What I remember most was the neat rows of tents of the troops while the firemen had to sleep on the grass or on their trucks. Dad didn't talk much about what went on except to say they had no police or military backup. Therefore, their only defense against the snipers fired from the rooftops was to direct the fire hose at them. Discussion of the causes and consequences of the events continue, but one truth was undeniable, and that was the lack of diversity within the police force and fire department. This issue requires swift correction, and on August 18, 1967, the first black trooper in a 50-year history of the Michigan State police force was sworn in. Race had to be considered in hiring and promotion. In 68, 35% of the new hires of the Detroit Police Department were black, and by 72, the percentage of black officers doubled to 14% from just 7% in 67. Race also had to be considered in promotions, not a popular concept among those passed over for promotion and the associated higher salary. Although Dad and his colleagues in the fire and the police departments would rail against the practice, these efforts were justified in a laudable effort to deal with an inherent uneven playing field and long-standing discriminatory practices. The riots accelerated so-called white flight out of the city and exacerbated an eroding tax base and further crippling an already failing public education system. I'm a member of the OSU College of Medicine Admissions Committee, and diversity is certainly an important topic when it comes to choosing students for our medical school classes. The term we use to help level the playing field for some candidates in order to advance the diversity initiative is distance traveled. So most medical schools have attained gender diversity, but achieving adequate representation of so-called underrepresented minorities, that is Black, Hispanic, Alaskan, and Native American, in med school classes requires a sustained effort and remains a constant work in progress. A medical school, especially one accepting public funds, has the responsibility and should be compelled to graduate a student population that mirrors the makeup of the community it serves. So we had a very middle-class upbringing, a solid foundation, and the freedom to play sports, something Dad didn't have in the Great Depression. All the boys back then had to work to put food on the table. Competitive sports were a luxury they couldn't afford. Mom and Dad encouraged recreation and playing organized sports, and we competed on the playing field and in the classroom. When it was time for high school graduation, we had an opportunity our parents didn't have, and that was to continue our education in college. Terry was MVP of both his high school basketball and football teams and accepted a scholarship to Northwestern under head coach Alex Agassi, and eventually obtained a law degree from the Detroit College of Law. My brother Al went to Seminary High School in Newark, Ohio, and then went to the University of Detroit for theology. He received a master's of social work from Wayne, and I accepted a merit scholarship to attend Wayne State. I played football for 4 years, and ultimately gained admission to the medical school. But I don't want to oversell my football experience. I started one game in 4 years as a sophomore against Youngstown State. My main contribution was probably the scout team. I played a lot of special teams. But the lessons learned on the gridiron probably had the biggest, longest lasting, and most profound impact on my overall education. These lessons may be as important or more so than those learned in the classroom, and have more to do with heart, humility, and other intangibles, such as what do you do when you get knocked down? You get up. What do you do when you get defeated? Take a beating, you shake hands, improve yourself and your team, and you vow that it not happen again. The coaching staff came from Akron in '74 and included head coach Dick Lowry and defensive coordinator Dick Tressel, who would leave Wayne in '77, and linebacker coach Dave Vasella was promoted to coordinator. And one of Coach Vasella's famous sayings was, "You're never wrong when you're right," meaning that you can really mess up your assignment, but if you make the tackle, all's well. Of course, the corollary is you're never right when you're wrong. So in surgical terms, you can make all the right moves, but still find yourself on the chopping block at M&M if the patient has a downward turn. You'll find accomplishments in sports and physical endeavors in general are quite common among recent past presidents of the MSA, including Margot Shoup, Roxy Albrecht, Chris McHenry, and Rick Bird's adventures on the high seas of Lake St. Clair. In fact, in a recent leadership symposium I moderated at the American Society of Colorectal Surgeons in Nashville in May, panelist Hiram Polk, Jr., had an interesting response to the query of what he looks for in a candidate for general surgery residency. He quoted, "The children of teachers," let me get through this, "the children of teachers, athletes, and musicians seem to make the best trainees and ultimately surgeons." As a fourth-year general surgery resident, Margot Shoup had this take. Ultimately, she loves being a surgeon several times more, but so based on my affinity for anatomy in medical school, a career in surgery seemed a natural, and based on some very mediocre, borderline pitiful National Board of Surgery clerkship scores in year 3, I knew I'd be more competitive at a community program. However, when I stated my intention of considering general surgery training outside of a university, I was told by some faculty in no uncertain terms that one could not obtain good surgical training in these community programs. The question was posed, why would someone train outside of an academic medical center? I was told I might as well go to another field altogether, had I considered family practice. This line of inquiry only triggered testaduta, and I doubled down to obtain a categorical position and completed general surgery training at St. John, not far from where I grew up in Detroit's northeast side. Can you advance that slide for me? Thank you. And again. Of the 15 categorical general surgery residents at St. John when I began in '85, 11 were graduates of Wayne State University School of Medicine. Thank you. A pretentious cardiac surgeon at St. John who trained at the Cleveland Clinic always spoke about how they did things at the clinic. The clinic this, the clinic that. We were all supposed to know what clinic he was talking about. Well, our answer to the clinic was to refer to St. John Medical Center as the John. So my first stay at the John in July 1985 was also the first day as an attending for Abed Hawasli, a graduate of the University of Damascus. He had just completed general surgery training at St. John and joined the private general surgery practice of Paul Rizzo. There's Eric and Dan and I starting. The issue of where to get the best general surgery training in '85 or any year is an interesting one. However, something happened in the late '80s to turn this conventional wisdom upside down, thanks to the evolution and revolution of laparoscopic surgery. With the approval of the interim chief of surgery, Larry Lloyd, Dr. Hawasli performed the first laparoscopic cholecystectomy in the state of Michigan on November 22, 1989. He led a small group of general surgeons who initiated laparoscopic cholecystectomy at St. John, including Drs. Lloyd, Don Schroeder, and John Boccaccio. Dr. Hawasli had a personal experience well past 100 cases by the time I completed training in '90, and a year later he had over 540. On the other end of the spectrum, when I began my career at Downstate in New York in '91, I found that the chairman of the department had locked up the laparoscopic equipment and would not allow laparoscopic cholecystectomy. Now there was a clear difference in general surgery training between academic and community general surgery programs. The laparoscopic revolution originated in the community and private sector and not in the academic ranks, and this was truly an anomaly, a true paradigm shift in the field of surgery. I point this out not to be derisive or divisive regarding the merits of academic versus community general surgery training programs, or the wisdom and surgical acumen of faculty involved in the programs. To the contrary, and on a positive note, I believe we should recognize the inherent strengths and weaknesses on either side, but more so we should appreciate that this organization, the MSA, seamlessly brings these two reportedly disparate groups of surgeons together, the proverbial town and gowns, under one roof, perhaps better and for a longer sustained period of time than any other surgical society. There's been let's catch up. Simply look at the near 50-50 split over the past 60 years of our past presidents in private practice and academia. Following a 3-year stay in academic surgery at SUNY Downstate, including a rather limited breadth and volume of colorectal cases, my wife Susan's extended family lived in Kansas City, and so I accepted an offer to join a solo colorectal surgeon in a private practice setting with the promise and expectation of becoming a partner in a year, all based on a handshake deal, similar to a handshake deal that Rick Byrd had with Joe Grady. That's how you do it in the Midwest. Unfortunately, after moving and effectively losing any leverage, my handshake deal proved insufficient, and I was coerced into signing a contract that contained a no-compete clause or a restrictive covenant. However, so by 1999, I had outperformed my associate. However, I was still officially an employee. He had reneged on the partnership promise. So I signed a series of 1-year contracts with the RC that metastasized from a single sentence to several pages. The struggling solo practice in '94 was now humming along in 2000, but I was being set up for termination to be replaced by cheap labor, an old trick, as letters were sent to program directors and and secret interviews were held with candidates finishing their training in the spring of 2000. Moreover, I've been kind of routinely told I was worthless and that I was a failure, and maybe I should consider changing my career perhaps to family practice. So here we go. The numbers don't lie. I couldn't be the lead revenue producer in '99 if I was a hack. The final blow against my association with the practice was a period of time in early 2000 when the staff were given secret orders that I was not to see any new patients. That allowed me to coach Amy's basketball team at 3:30 or 3:15 in the afternoon. The office staff confided in me their secret marching orders, that I was under some sort of double secret probation, but it was all too obvious, as the schedule book pointed out. The business manager followed her script and pointed out that I couldn't possibly keep up with 50%, my 50% share of the overhead. So ultimately, I did what I figured was the honorable thing. I resigned, but also made it clear I wasn't going anywhere. There was a 25-mile radius around 12 scattered hospitals. It was an effective blanket over the city. But surprisingly, he would pull me into an empty hallway from time to time before I officially resigned and stepped away. And he asked me to reconsider my resignation and stay on in the practice. So a quintessential passive-aggressive bipolar feast of psychosocial pathology that made escape from this nightmare even more important. It was during that time that connections to surgical societies like this one were critical to my emotional well-being and surviving the insanity. We went to trial over this St. Valentine's Day 2001, and 2 days later the judge took 15 minutes to return a verdict, finding for the plaintiff in the contract, upholding this massive restricted area. I was even brought in on contempt of court charges a year later. I was told I was using a non-restrictive hospital, which is St. Luke's, to see new patients, and somehow that was construed as a breach. They wanted $1,000 a day, which is $300,000. The judge said $30,000, suspended it. They wanted me put in jail. He said, no, he wouldn't do that, but the next time he told me to bring a toothbrush for treating patients. Nice. So these are our office locations. My associations with the general surgeons and small community hospitals were crucial, as I was able to be helpful to them with their clinical issues in struggling hospitals as they were to me for my career survival. And these are some of the folks. Being restricted to small community hospitals on the fringes of Kansas City provided clinical opportunities to see and operate on rather a large contingent of elderly women with rectal prolapse, and it led to a personal series. Also, the multidisciplinary management of rectal cancer, including an assessment of whether elderly patients could tolerate neoadjuvant chemoradiotherapy, I presented last year, and the outcomes of a high-volume surgeon in a low-volume community hospital I presented this year, that wouldn't have happened without this. So when life hands you lemons, I guess lemonade is what you make. We survived in this restrictive environment long enough to have an appeal heard at the University of Kansas Law School, not far from our Lawrence office. Transcripts from the trial, three-judge appellate court heard 15-minute oratories, and plaintiff's counsel included now 3 teams of lawyers. The new attorney heading up the appeal, amazingly decided to ditch the original strategy that I was no good, that I should be run out. And he said that I was actually a pretty good surgeon, but the restrictive covenant should hold up because that pushes me out in the perimeter where there were no colorectal surgeons. Well, that's flawed because you can't survive out there. In a unanimous decision in May 2003, the Court of Appeals overturned a lower court decision for reasons of public policy, as it did not make sense for the state of Kansas to have one less surgical specialist in an already underserved field of colorectal surgery. So plaintiff went to the Supreme Court, which they denied it, but it kept me out another six months. So my conclusion on this unexpected career detour is that we are often our own worst enemies. A restrictive covenant between attorneys is never held up in a U.S. court. The legal profession, as much as we love to joke about lawyers, including my brother, is on a much higher ethical plane than the medical profession in this area. Although attorneys will gladly draw these restrictive covenants up for any profession or business, they believe the client should have the freedom to choose the attorney of their choice. I think it's a sad commentary on the priorities of the medical profession. Do our patients come first or business interests? Should commerce trump patient care? During these crazy years, I would become chair of the American College of Surgeons, Committee on Young Surgeons, which is now the Young Fellows Association, and we were able to pass Statement on Principles 47 that warns of the negative impact of restrictive covenants, and which includes any restrictive covenant that interferes with the uninterrupted delivery of qualified surgical care to patients is considered unethical. Restrictive covenants should not disrupt the surgeon-patient relationship, which the college holds sacred. I surveyed young members of the ASCRS through the Young Surgeons Committee and published a negative impact on responders regarding these covenants. In a bulletin article, I documented the history of restrictive covenants and how the AMA, which once banned the practice, suddenly and inexplicably changed its stance in 1960 and now limply states that it discourages the practice of no-compete clauses. RC restrictive covenants among physicians became so disruptive that many states passed legislation banning the practice. Restrictive covenants remain a critical issue for young surgeons, whether they join a private practice or join the growing trend of surgeons becoming hospital-employed or contract surgeons for those practicing in states that allow these things. Moving on, future directions. So the long association between MSA and Grand Hotel goes back to the '72 meeting. A recent survey was sent to query membership about our ongoing commitment to this summer resort hotel. The results were quite favorable, including it being family-friendly, 95% total, dining 89% either satisfied or very satisfied. Less so travel, 65%, and cost, 53%. Nearly 70% thought the frequency should remain the same in every other year. These are some of the positive comments, and there were many, but they were tempered by some negative comments. And certainly, council recognizes the problems with travel and cost. I queried past President Dr. Charles Lucas a comment on Grand Hotel as the MSA meeting location. He simply stated, "It is who we are." As local arrangements chair, we've been created to try and maintain the fun, family aspects of the meeting without damaging society assets. To address the reality of diminishing reimbursements of the 90s, less enthusiasm and free time for surgeons to attend these meetings, and combined with increased costs, changes were made to keep the tenor and substance of the MSA experience here at Grand Hotel without plundering society assets. That is why we dine here at the hotel before embarking on events such as the Fort this evening or cruising the Straits of Mackinac. The combined meeting last year with the Central was an unequivocal success, with 91% satisfied or very satisfied. 89% would attend future meetings, and then some comments. The question on frequency, every third or every other, what's going to happen is going to be every 4 for now. We're going to meet again in 2021. with our last meeting being 2017. Questions regarding will your family attend the meeting? Kind of 50-50, mostly due to empty nesters, although one member noted that when they go, the family will go when they go to the Mackinac meeting. Question, I would prefer a combined meeting in no preference, urban or Mackinac resort setting, kind of mixed. So during tough times for both surgeons and surgical societies, we seek direction, advice, and even inspiration from various sources. No matter our training or practice environment, academic or community-based, MD or DO, we all share a medical school education based on in an academic setting. My education at Wayne included interactions with outstanding surgical faculty, many of whom are still at the institution and still in active practice. The MSA, with its origins in the state of Illinois, chose to broaden across the Midwest, and the next state up was Michigan. There was a very positive impact on the organization, beginning with the 1972 meeting at Grand Hotel, organized by Program Chair Bob Wilson. In fact, the first 4 non-Illinois MSA presidents were all Wayne State faculty: Burkus, Wilson, Lucas, and Albin. MSA would go on to include surgeons from the states of Indiana, Wisconsin, Iowa, Ohio, and other neighboring states represented in this list. The WCU faculty member that has left off the past president's list is a longtime chair of the department, Alexander J. Walt. However, Dr. Walt did give the first William Hunter Heritage Lecture, History of Thyroid Surgery, at the 1974 meeting here at Grand Hotel. Dr. Walt was born in Cape Town, South Africa in 1923, the youngest of 3 sons and 2 daughters to Lee and Isaac Walt, a wholesale grocer who emigrated from Lithuania to escape the pogrom. At the age of 2.5, his mother traveled by train to pick up 2 daughters at boarding school, and on a return trip, the train crashed and killed 125 people, including Dr. Walt's mother and 2 sisters. Isaac Walt was determined that his 3 sons would receive an education, and all 3 became physicians. Dr. Walt left the University of Cape Town Medical School in year 1 to enlist in World War II. He served 3.5 years with the 6th South African Armored, with the 5th U.S. Army in Egypt, Greece, and throughout the entire Italian campaign. His service with the surgical team in the field instilled a long-abiding interest in trauma and certainly shaped his later responses to the Detroit civil disturbance. After the war, he graduated in '48, served an internship at Groote Schuur Hospital in Cape Town, and then took a residency position at the Mayo Clinic. According to John Walt, his oldest son and an attorney in Detroit, Dr. Walt returned to England as a surgical registrar at St. Martin's Hospital, Bath, where he described the chief of surgery as a butcher, and after witnessing several surgical mortalities, he returned to Cape Town at Groote Schuur, but ultimately did not want to raise the family in the political climate of the day, apartheid. Therefore, in 1961, he took a WCU Department of Surgery faculty position at the VA in Allen Park, and rapidly rose to chief of surgery, at receiving in 1965. In the following year, he was named chair of the department and Penberthy professor of surgery at Wayne, positions he held until his retirement in 1988. He chaired the ASCS Board of Regents and was elected 75th president of the college. Unfortunately, in his presidential year, 1994, he developed a massive recurrence of bladder cancer, 12 years after initial treatment. He interrupted his chemotherapy so as not to miss the 1994 Clinical Congress. I was an initiate to the college that year, along with my partner at Downstate, Rich Golub. WSU Med School classmates John Sachs and Eric Schmidt were also there. With great humility, Dr. Walt began his 1994 presidential address with, "I stand here as the first foreign medical graduate to be president of the college," and he went on to say that the election of an FMG testifies to the great generosity of our American society, to its warmth, tolerance, acceptance of strangers, willingness to experiment, and its disdain for artificial barriers. I stand here very proud, very grateful to the fellows, and in very deep debt to the country that has made this honor possible. The debt can only be acknowledged, never fully repaid. I cannot resist an analogy between the entry into fellowship in this college and into citizenship of this nation. To the many initiates here tonight who are immigrants like myself, I do not have to explain the extraordinary sensation experienced on taking this country's oath of allegiance, a similar occasion of pride and dedication. Dr. Walt believed in a surgeon scholar and thought surgeons should have a breadth and depth of interest. He believed that a cultured surgeon is a better surgeon, which his life pursuits and training program reflected. WC Department of Surgery grand rounds in the Kresge Auditorium at Harper began with a 5-minute talk related to these interests given by a third-year medical student on topics such as history or physician, writer, poets such as William Carlos Williams and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. I was too much a coward to volunteer for one of these talks, but my classmates did. However, I did have an interesting anecdote with Dr. Walt. When I arrived for a scheduled appointment during my year 3 rotation to discuss my interest in surgery and asked for a letter of support, I'd spent the previous night on call and was dressed in scrubs. You want to know what I had done the night before. I described the case of a patient with severe rectal pain taken for an EUA under anesthesia in the OR, and he was found to have a chicken bone lodged in the anal canal causing his symptoms. It was removed. Chairman's rounds began in the ICU a few hours later, and 10 to 15 residents and students on the surgery service attended. The last case presented to Dr. Walt that day was an unusual case of severe rectal pain of unknown origin. The resident put up the associated flat plate of the abdomen on the view box, and Dr. Walt peered at the film. He peered for a while pronouncing his diagnosis, chicken bone in the rectum, and made a quick exit stage left to his office as 10 to 15 heads rapidly filled the void, straining to see what the old man saw in the x-ray. Acting. In the fall of '92, in my first academic position in New York City at Downstate, we ventured into laparoscopic cholecystectomy. The patient went on, we were roundly criticized by senior faculty, and rightly so, for experimenting. The patient went on to develop port site and extraction site metastasis 9 months later. We published that it would be the second U.S. and fourth case of port site metastasis published worldwide. Our conclusion that these cases should be performed under study conditions mirrored the ASCRS's approved statement on laparoscopic colectomy published in DCR each month from July to December of '94, which found it premature to endorse the operation, noting the absence of 5-year survival data, and recommended such operations be performed in an environment where the outcomes can be meaningfully evaluated, and encouraged randomized prospective studies to evaluate the safety, efficacy, and benefits of the alternative. Well, that came a few years later with the cost trial. As lead author, I was invited to respond to a letter to the editor from the sitting editor-in-chief of DCR, who was critical of our conclusions. I ended my reply with a classic quote from Dr. Walt's Gerald Marks lecture at the 1994 SAGES scientific session. In the case of colectomy, I submit that a randomized prospective study is essential and that no colectomies outside the trial should be permitted until data are available. Operations should not be trophies. They must always be performed for the greater good of the patient, not for the glory or amusement of the surgeon. The other remembrance I wanted to submit from John Walt was the fact that his father was fully engaged in the Michigan-OSU football rivalry. Dr. Walt would put on his maize and blue gear and watch the game alone behind closed doors in their Huntington Woods home, a suburb north of Detroit. Dr. Walt's wife, Irene, would inform the children that they absolutely could not disturb their father during the game. Timing is everything. And after 11 years in a solo private practice in Kansas City, 17 altogether, OSU was looking for another colorectal surgeon to add to their newly minted division of colorectal surgery, but also needed someone to help establish and run a colorectal residency training program. Our colorectal residency gained initial ACGME accreditation 1/15/16 and recent full 10-year full accreditation to 2028. I want to acknowledge, as a department member, faculty member, I want to acknowledge the contributions and give equal time to our old man in Ohio at OSU, and that's Robert Zollinger, the big Z or Zolly, who built the Department of Surgery at OSU from the ground up and left a lasting legacy that was memorialized in a Fetch shrift published in the American Journal of Surgery in 2003 to honor the 100th anniversary of his birth on a farm in Millersport in central Ohio. He was the first person of his high school to attend college. He obtained his undergraduate and medical education at OSU. He chose OSU because it was the only college I knew about. I never knew a graduate. OSU was nearby and cheap. Zollinger reflected, somehow I wanted to be a surgeon, although the sight of blood makes me sick. And I got a C in surgery, and I said then I was coming back as a professor of surgery. He traveled to Boston for a surgical internship interview at the Mass General, and while there discovered the infamous Boston Interview Week and applied on the spot to Boston City Hospital and the Brigham. He did well at the Brigham interview with Drs. Cushing, David Cheever, and Merrill Sossman, but he was puzzled. At the ending of the interview, Dr. Sossman asked him why Michigan always seemed to beat Ohio State in football. At that time, the all-time series stood Michigan 19 wins, OSU 3, 2 ties, unaware that Sossman from Chillicothe and Cushing from Cleveland were both Ohioans. He was accepted to the Brigham as of January 1, 1929. He was fond of reminiscing of those internship days, regarded as a country boy from that cowtown Columbus. The Harvard residents would ask me, what do they teach you at Ohio State, Zollinger, culture or agriculture? I told them, quiz me, you SOBs, and find out. Zollinger returned as professor and chair of the OSU Department of Surgery in 1947 and remained so until 1974. Among his achievements were the so-called Triple Crown of American Surgery when he was president of the ASA, chairman of the ABS, and president of the college. Amazingly, he was an editor-in-chief of our MSA-affiliated journal, the American Journal of Surgery, from 1958 to 1986. He would famously turn down the presidency of OSU as it would not leave any time for him to continue operating. And besides, he reasoned that there are a lot more out-of-work college presidents than surgeons. From his OSU medical school days, he recalled, I smiled once when I promptly answered one of Dr. Buck's, an anatomy professor's, questions, much to his surprise because no one could answer those questions. He said, sit down, Zollinger, I'll take that smile off your face. I learned then that I think that education by fear and discipline works best. He was described as a difficult taskmaster. On rounds, he was known to fire a resident on the elevator for some misdemeanor, only to rehire him by the time they had reached the 7th floor. He told a resident he was fired over the telephone for incompetence. Leave and don't come back. But the resident couldn't leave because he was on call. He waited in the lobby of University Hospital until Zollinger appeared. All friendly and full of smiles, he put his arm across Art's shoulder as he walked to the elevator as if nothing had ever happened. The resident, Art Simpson, would write, his bark was worse than his bite. The trauma of the residency has made practicing surgery seem easy. Dan Elliott described the highlight of my career at Ohio State when, as a senior resident on Zolly's service, he admitted the famous patient who led to the discovery of ZE syndrome, a 26-year-old who underwent a vagotomy, a VMP, Billroth 1, another resection, and finally gastric radiation, but presented back with pain from a huge gastric acid outlet. Dr. Ellison had a similar patient who died with uncontrollable gastric hemorrhage, and at autopsy they found islet cell tumor in her pancreas. They resected the remaining stomach. Dr. Ellison was there and exposed a very normal appearing pancreas, but Ellison pointed out 2 small lymph nodes on its surface and asked Zollinger to take them out. Always a skeptic, Zollinger replied, oh, go wash your glasses, Eddie. There's enough inflammation in here to engorge all her nodes. But he promptly removed them. The 2 nodes were islet cell tumors, perfectly matching Ellison's previous patient, and the syndrome was born. Tim Fabian ran afoul of the old man when he theorized about using local anesthetics in wounds for postoperative pain control and mentioned it on rounds. Remember, you little bastard, if you thought of this today, I thought of it 30 years ago. And sure enough, Fabian found an article by Zollinger, Observations on the Use of Prolonged Anesthetic Agents in Upper Abdominal Incisions, July 1941 issue of Surgery. He concluded it was pretty hard to get one up on the old man. Fabian noted Zollinger was recognized as one of the great technical surgeons in the country. His prowess was legendary, and that reputation was partly responsible for taking Ohio State from a modest program in the Midwest to one of the fine surgical teaching programs in the U.S. Fabian considered Zollinger one of the greatest role models any surgeon could wish for. And he would always tell us that if you were going to be an academic surgeon, you had to be like a squid and drop a lot of ink. Zollinger felt patients should be the top priority of a surgeon. When he felt his staff was straying from that principle, he would remind them, once by making a large chart revealing the golf handicaps of each surgery department member, thus showing where he felt their priorities lie. He was proud to say that he had been a member of the Columbus Country Club for 40 years, and he never stepped foot on the golf course. On his relationship with Woody Hayes, Woody and I are good friends, but I think I was a little more controlled. Hayes' feelings for Zollinger can be summed up by the inscription on a framed autograph of Woody on his wall. I'm sure glad I didn't coach against you. So what's with all the story and anecdotes? I think these are sources of information, but also of inspiration. We talked a little bit about Ephraim McDowell's Sunday night, the first successful laparotomy in 1809, an operation born of absolute desperation of a woman with a 22-pound abdominal mass, and she's told she'll probably die whether there's an attempt at resection or not. To go against the teachings of all the learned academic surgeons in Europe of the time, the absolute dedication to patient by surgeon was quite remarkable. As medical students, we would discuss the typical historical figures such as Halsted and all the rest. Well, what about McDowell, who did the impossible nearly a century before Halsted, Cushing, Gross, Agnew, Murphy? His lack of attachment to a university no doubt contributed to his relative anonymity, but by the same token, his solo private practice may have allowed the freedom to attempt the impossible. We are Midwest surgeons dedicated to the MSA. If anyone should know and recount these exploits, it should be Midwest surgeons. It should be us. If we don't tell our own collective story, who will? I proposed and council has accepted the idea of a historical lecture each year as part of our Sunday night sessions to be included in those spectacular problems sessions. We all come from institutions steeped in history, and it's about time we record these accomplishments, notable historical figures, and document advances made right here in the Midwest. Furthermore, if we are to attach a personality or name to such an historical address, I would suggest the name Alexander J. Walt, who invented these vignettes as part of the WSU Department of Surgery Grand Rounds. How about suggestions? Cleveland. How about George Cryle and the Cleveland Clinic? Chicago. Well, Alec Walt's Department of Surgery bred 4 presidents in 7 years, but Dr. Warren Cole was responsible for training practically this entire association at its inception as an Illinois society dedicated to the young surgeon. We need to know more about Dr. Cole, as he was largely responsible for mentoring a young women's surgery, the only women's surgery of her era in the program, who had an interest in transplant and would become the first female chief of surgery at 3,000-bed Cook County Hospital and the first woman chair of an academic department of surgery at OSU. She would sign up Mark Arnold as the first colorectal surgeon at OSU in 1990. How about a connection to Mackinac? Christopher Reeve was the male lead of the film Somewhere in Time. You can't miss it here on the island when you walk down the halls. It was shot here in Mackinac in 1979. He had a high spinal cord injury which left him quadriplegic and depended on a ventilator for survival. The timing was perfect for implantation of a diaphragm pacing system developed by our own MSA past President Ray Anders. Of course, the saga of Beaumont and Alexis Saint-Martin, the 19-year-old French-Canadian voyageur, he nursed back to health after a close-range shotgun wound not far from here, created a gastrocutaneous fistula, a window to the world of human digestion. How about a Chicago surgeon with a Mackinac Island connection? So John Benjamin Murphy, who along with fellow Chicago and Franklin Martin helped establish the college in 1913, while suffering from increasing chest pain, and he had suffered from angina for years. In the heat of the summer of 1916, he came to Grand Hotel with his wife and doctor friends L.L. MacArthur and James Keefe for rest and to escape the heat. He died at this hotel on 3:30 p.m. Friday, August 11, 1916. He was so well known that the New York Times ran his obituary that same day in the afternoon edition. Life and death on Mackinac Island, indeed. We do have an historian now, and that's Richard Berg. I think it was a perfect choice. He's a logical historian. He has a photographic memory. His longevity with the association since 1980, but mostly because he's got a lot of room in his basement. Right, Mary? So I would like to recognize and thank those of you who have kindly contributed to my education and my career, starting in medical school. I'll zip through these. We're late. Residency and fellowship, Rick and Mary, Don and Laura. John and Kathy, and the guys, Dan and Eric. Residency at St. Vincent's, Larry Russin and John Riley, two titans, I believe. Larry moved on to the Leahy Clinic. John's been there forever. Great mentors. Trained under Frank Spencer at NYU. And Rich Golub, my first partner. Also, OSU faculty and staff, including my division associates. Thank you. And my personal assistant, Emily, who helped with all this stuff. And Midwest Surgical. You know who you are. Thank you all. Council, LP, Jill, Margie, Corinne, and my legal team, sadly, but I have to recognize them. Family, my brother-in-law Stephen, sister-in-law Carrie and Scott, Al and Pat, who live in Minneapolis area now, Al's daughters. Terry and Mary Beth, thank you for being here today, and their daughters, Colleen and Emily. And that's my big brother. So this is what we do on Thanksgiving in Detroit. We may not win, but we have a good time. Mom's 90. She's still living in Rochester Hills. And who would have thought the 1996 MSA meeting, which was my first, would be the only time we could bring Mom and Dad with us to Grand Hotel. Back then, the golf event was played on the back nine or the woods. It played long and difficult. Dad loved it. He's a big golfer. We lost him to pancreatic cancer the following spring, 1997. After living through the Great Depression, World War II, the riots, he had just settled into retirement. Sometimes life isn't fair. Lastly, and most importantly, I want to thank my immediate family. So, yeah, that's Amy. Okay, so she's the oldest. She's working hard and going to nursing school. She's with us in Columbus. She finally discovered what her mother was telling her all these years about nursing being an awesome profession. Well, that's pretty accurate. Next up, Andrew. He worked in the real world for a time after failing to gain admission to medical school. He recently decided to take the MCAT, and he took it last summer. He reapplied and gained admission to LECOM, Lake Erie College of Medicine, the Seton Hill campus outside Pittsburgh, not far from us. He gets 4 testaduras because he hung in there despite all the negatives, blocking out the constant drone of negativism that he would never gain admission. So Claire's our New Yorker. She's our middle child, and she has a degree in art history from Wayne. And she works at the, yeah, you like that? That's a Mackinac shirt. So she works at Cranbrook Institute, just outside Detroit. The Kansas twins, Kay and Peter, they're still engaged in education, formal and informal, searching for the meaning of life in the city of Detroit. There we go. Thank you for putting up with the crazy, wacky times that turned out the way you did. Your mother and I are proud of the people you turned out to be. Finally, I want to thank the real star of the show, my lovely wife, Susan. We met in the OR at the John. We're married in St. Edward Chapel off 1 West and had our first 2 children there. She's the rock during our rough years, forced to take over all aspects of the office, somehow still keep things rolling on the home front. Her experienced hand at handling financial debt was important, and unwavering confidence that we held the moral and ethical high ground were crucial. Wife, mother, nurse, chef, mechanic. She's the heart and soul, the captain of our little cruise ship set for adventure. It's been a wild ride. Thank you for always being positive and hanging in there for 30 plus years. Susan was the first member of our family to visit Mackinac Island. National championship game. 6 months old, 1958. She's in the last row. She's in her mother's lap. And her brother Stephen has the hat on in his father's lap, Monroe Brickner, Monroe and Mary Margaret. And just a plug for the French Lick meeting next year. Apparently they have go-karts. Well, Susan is the go-kart girl, so watch out. All right, so lastly, Back in '68, our cities were on fire and turmoil. In the aftermath of the assassinations of MLK and RFK, an incident occurred during the medal ceremony for the 200-meter dash at Mexico City. It was October 16. The three medalists wore Olympic Project for Human Rights badges, and gold medalist Tommy Smith and bronze medalist John Carlos gave a human rights salute. That caused a furor. The two U.S. athletes were shoeless and wearing black socks to represent black poverty. Smith wore a black scarf around his neck to represent black pride, and Carlos had his tracksuit top unzipped to show solidarity with all U.S. blue-collar workers. Carlos forgot his black gloves, so they split Smith's pair, and each had an arm raised and head bowed as an anthem played. Their gesture became front-page news worldwide. Smith said, "If I win, I'm American, not a black American. But if I did something bad, then they'd say I'm a Negro. We're black and we're proud of being black. Black America will understand what we did tonight." But right on cue, IOC President Avery Brundage, a native of Chicago and the University of Illinois, forced their expulsion from the Mexico Games and the Games forever, described the event as the nasty demonstration against the American flag by Negroes. Does this ring a bell? So NFL players, in solidarity with the blight and plight of many of our big cities, including here in the Midwest, Milwaukee, Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland, Indy, also made simple gestures during the anthem last season. These gestures were said to be anti-American, anti-flag, anti-military by the mainstream press, especially by the billionaire boys club of the NFL owners, who make $9 billion a year and they net $1 billion. These are the folks that tried to conceal CTE and punish the brave pathologists who came forward with that data. The No Fun League. These gestures are quite the opposite of un-American. It's an expression of our most sacred right as Americans, the right to free speech guaranteed by the First Amendment to the Constitution, something we all take for granted. The British don't have such an amendment, such freedom. If you say something against the crown, you can end up in jail. Carlos and Smith were banned from the Olympics for life, and Peter Norman, the Australian silver medalist who sympathized with them, also paid a heavy price. He was not allowed on the '72 Australian Olympic team despite qualifying 13 times over. In 2012, Australia formally apologized to Norman as a member of Parliament stated in a session of the Australian Parliament that Norman's gesture was a moment of heroism and humility that advanced international awareness for racial inequality. This took place 6 years after his death in '06. Carlos and Smith were two of his pallbearers. Carlos and Smith were redeemed by San Jose State University, where they graduated, in 2005 by a 22-foot high statue of their protest titled Victory Salute. Peter Norman requested that his spot on the medal stand be left empty so that viewers could stand in his place and feel what he felt. Tommy Smith would say years later that we were concerned about the lack of black assistant coaches, about how Muhammad Ali got stripped of his title. You remember, he said, I got nothing against no Viet Cong. No Viet Cong ever called me the N-word. About the lack of access to good housing and our kids not being able to attend the top colleges. I fear that there may be lack of access to any college on economic grounds as the gulf between the haves and the have-nots continues to grow exponentially in this country. Why is this important? Well, there's a slow drip as it is of the pipeline to medical school from the middle and low socioeconomic groups, which might dry up entirely. We're going to go back to the 19th century related to that. Will there ever be another Ben Carson to come out of the Detroit public school system? The youngest chair of pediatric neurosurgery in the country at Hopkins in 1984 at age 33. So lastly, it takes an immigrant to recognize and truly appreciate what this country has to offer. As a son of an immigrant, I would like to think I have the same sense of awe and appreciation for this great experiment in self-rule that began nearly 250 years ago. Growing up, we had some neighbors who were right off the boat, as Mom would say. Right, Laura Schroeder? So Laura Sylvester Schroeder grew up a couple blocks away from us. She survived the public schools, and we carpooled to Wayne as freshmen. Mom would sometimes mention that these individuals, these Italians off the boat, would sometimes whine and complain about life in the U.S., and they talked about how great things were back in the old country, and that would really irritate Mom. Her take on this lack of appreciation, there it is, go home. Mom wondered why I chose colorectal surgery. Yeah, we get that a lot. Perhaps it was years of listening to her complain about her piles from an early age. Well, years later, I'd learned that piles are sort of a European slang for hemorrhoids. Or perhaps it goes back to age 10 when I first encountered the word colostomy. Growing up, I would receive books at Christmas, typically with a sports theme. So in '68, I read Jerry Kramer's Instant Replay, an account of the '67 Green Bay Packers championship season. And in '69, I read his Farewell to Football. Chapter 3, On the Edge of Death. He describes having a proximal transverse loop colostomy for a sigmoid colon perforation at the Mayo Clinic in November of '64. He described the glass rod support and bedside maturation or unveiling of the stoma. 2 days later, it says circa 1910. It's kind of an old way to approach this, but he described the Bovie unit. He said it was a wood-burning kit. He noted the awful smell as a stool ran down his side and onto the bed. So if you don't know Jerry Kramer, that's okay. He made the block on Jethro Pugh of the Cowboys to allow Bart Starr to fall into the end zone and win the Ice Bowl in minus 13 degrees weather in late December '67. This was a fourth down play. If he gets stopped, game over. Jerry Kramer's a hero because he's an author, but he was All-Pro 5 times, won 5 NFL championships, and was on the All-NFL first 50 years team. Yet he was never voted into the Hall of Fame. Apparently, the old AFL players infiltrated the Hall of Fame voting committee, and they were sick and tired of voting in old Green Bay Packers, so Jerry Kramer failed to gain entry after 10 nominations. The boys and I happened to meet him at an autograph session in Kansas City, the first and last time I ever attended such a paid autograph session. But I couldn't pass up the opportunity to meet him and shake his hand, which was gnarled, and the fingers were bent in all different directions. You never heard Jerry Kramer whine about any of this. His daughter Alicia gets 4 testaduras for defying her father's wishes and starting a movement 5 years ago to gather 65 letters from Hall of Fame players supporting his election into the Hall. If there was one place I'd rather be this weekend than at this meeting, it'd be in Canton, Ohio, because 2 days ago, Jerry Kramer at 82 was finally inducted into the Hall of Fame. Where would we be without family? So it's been, and cheeseheads. All right, Youpers. So it's been a distinct pleasure, privilege, and honor to be your president, the pinnacle of my career. We've had an outstanding meeting, starting with a record-breaking 139 abstracts submitted and near record attendance. We have 15 new members, 4 of whom are DOs. With the blending of DO surgical residencies that's currently in transition, we will all come under the aegis of the ACGME. We especially welcome the faculty and residents from these DO programs into our surgical family, perhaps the last barrier among surgeons to fall. We're all in this together. Welcome. We are not doing too badly for an organization with such humble beginnings that many predicted would not survive. There are forces present that threaten medical and surgical societies, such as economics and shifts in generational habits, wants, and needs. Yet this organization thrives despite these challenges. I think it is a testament to the organization that my selection as president was mainly based on by my years as local arrangements chair for the Mackinac meetings, starting in 2004. It speaks volumes about the heart of this organization that values time spent with family as well as friends and colleagues in an atmosphere that combines science and family values. Yes, it can be done and has been done for 60 years. I call on our young members to step forward, offer up your services, and be part of our success story. We need your expertise in social media, tweets, Facebook, newsletters. We don't know any of this stuff. Your energy and your continued participation, as in my case, you will get far more out of such service than you will ever put in. I call on your inner testaduda to prove all the naysayers wrong, those who question whether this society will survive. I'm convinced that you can test the vitality of the MSA by counting the number of strollers on the porch during our porch receptions. Let the word be spread. We need more surgeons with strollers. Let's set a course for the next 60 years of the MSA. Let's celebrate tonight together with muskets and cannons. Until we meet again next summer in French Lick, Indiana. Thank you.